p.m. on Ocala's News Talk, The Source 96.3 FM and 1370 AM.
Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala!
All right, 25 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. You know, Robin, as I was reading the information to prepare me for the interview we're about to have, it occurred to me that our founding fathers of this country were pretty smart in the way that they designed this government, because there has been very few times when any one party was absolutely in control. And of course, that's not always necessarily something everybody is happy with, but I think if I were one of the founding fathers and somehow I could maybe see what was going on from heaven or wherever, I think I'd be happy with the decision we made back then to make this the country that it is. Thomas F. Schaller is on the phone. He's a professor of political science at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and he writes a political column for the Baltimore Sun, and he's written a book. The book is called The Stronghold, and then the subtitle is How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. Good morning, Thomas Schaller. Good morning, Thomas.
Hey, Larry, thanks for having me on, and Tom is fine, please.
Okay, Tom. And Jim, are you going to join us with this? You going to join? And Jim Penna is in the studio with us as well. Let me make sure his microphone is on. Good morning again. So in your observations in the book, do you agree kind of with what I was saying in the intro, that this is kind of the way it was planned, that we would always have nobody in one absolute power?
Well, what's interesting about that is that the Founding Fathers were, writing the Constitution at a time before the development of the modern party system or even the colonial party system.
Yeah.
It really began with the 1800 Jefferson fight. And so they were all Federalists, and they didn't really envision parties as we see them today. They thought there'd be regional factions. That helps explain why they set up the Electoral College the way they did. That's why they set up the House and the Senate, large states and small states. But what's clear about the Founders' intent, regardless of their view of parties, and as I argue in the book, is that they wanted to be a Congress-centric government. And we know that if you landed from Mars and you didn't have an interpretive, political scientist or a political theorist to explain it to you, or James Madison for that matter, and you just looked at the document and you said, well, geez, Article 1, which is first, is about the Congress, and it's about half of the original Constitution if you hold the amendment side. They clearly wanted this to be a Congress-oriented government with a somewhat weaker presidency.
That's how I see it, too.
Yeah, but that's the way our government was for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, obviously Lincoln, until really the start of the 20th century, till Woodrow Wilson and the Roosevelts and so forth. And so what I argue in the book there is that in our last 60 years, we've had about 70% of the time divided government. And in the post-war period, that began with a lot of Republican presidents, Eisenhower through Reagan, Bush, and Democrats controlling Congress. And since the early 1990s, when Gingrich came around, and of course Clinton started 4 out of 6 victories for the Democrats, we've kind of switched. The two parties have passed like ships in the night. We have a stronger congressional party and a stronger Democratic presidential party and a stronger, Republican congressional party. And that's, I argue, if that's the new normal, conservatives in particular should be comfortable with that, given what the Founders intended for a Congress-centric government.
And the word president, the way I've always understood it, was intentionally picked because it's somebody who presides, not somebody who rules. Although, and I'm not picking on this president, because obviously you could go back to any of them in recent years, at least in my lifetime, where they are more, they're not quite like kings, but they're doing more than just presiding.
Well, and this is fascinating in the context of our current fights over things ranging from, voting rights to immigration policy, where you have Republicans now saying, the president, Obama, of course, is overreaching. He's using his executive authority too much. He's just ignoring the Congress. And it was liberals and Democrats who were making those exact same arguments 8 years ago about Bush on, on things like, terrorism and security and surveillance and the use of executive orders to sort of just, say, I'm going to sign this signing statement, and yes, I'm going to pass this law into power, but I'm going to sign a signing statement saying I can choose to ignore the parts that I don't think are constitutional.
Thomas, the one word in the subtitle that I wanted to focus on just for a second and have you comment on is the word how. It says how Republicans captured. What did the Republicans really capture, or was this more of the will of the people?
Well, I think there were strategic choices made by Republicans, and I spend a lot of time in this book looking at the late 80s and early 90s, basically the Bush 41 presidency, because that's when things flipped. And there's a whole bunch of moments in there, and I won't bore you with all the details, but for the Republican Party, two of the moments that I talk about are, first of all, when Dick Armey wrote a scathing critique of his own Republican president in the New York Times about the budget and the Dick Armey negotiation with the Democrats in Congress and Bush violating his no new taxes pledge. And the other was Mickey Edwards getting attacked from the right in his primary in 1992 and eventually losing that primary to Ernest Jim Istook, who became the Republican who replaced him. So it wasn't a loss of a seat by the Republicans, but it was a replacement, a sort of a early sort of warning of what was going to happen with this sort of Tea Party 15, 20 years later. And so there was an internal fight within the Republican Party, and in the end, the Republicans captured Congress in 94, lost the White House, of course, 2 years earlier. And since that time, they've spent a lot of time, as I argue in the book, reinforcing, protecting those congressional majorities, sometimes, especially, say, in the Dole campaign right away in 96, at the expense of their party's presidential nominees, and oftentimes with very conservative members who've made it difficult for presidential nominees to run because they're running from the party's congressional wing.
There's a very small faction of third-party representatives in Congress. I don't know what the numbers are, but do they play any role in this at all?
No, I mean, I'm a political scientist, and when students ask me, how come third parties, don't get farther? We have a country where 40% of Americans don't register with the two major parties, which is true. So shouldn't there be some sort of proportionate amount of, whatever it is, Green Party candidates or third party candidates? But we have single-member districts with plurality rule. It's really a structural problem, and unless the two parties ever give up their duopoly and change the electoral structure to something more like a European proportional representation system, that's never going to happen. 40% of the country is independent, but you only have about a handful of the 535 members of Congress who aren't Republicans or Democrats.
So when we look at it as the general public, we all lately anyway, we look at Congress like we look at a couple of spoiled kids. They're not getting along. Nobody's taking a leadership role, and that to me would be the presiding role, the president, to try to make sure that there was a way to come to some kind of a compromise. But even the president seems unwilling to compromise. Is that new, or have we always seen this?
No, I mean, our current era of polarization is really unprecedented, and that's true whether you look at mass measures or elite measures. If you look at elite measures like roll call votes in Congress, we have record levels of polarization where 90% of Republicans vote the opposite of 90% of Democrats. And we see elite mass polarization in terms of the ratings of the presidents. There's a partisan polarization measure that Gallup has been conducting for like 50 years. And the two presidents have the highest polarization measure are George W. Bush and Barack Obama, which means they're either have the most polarizing politics in the last 60 years, or the country is just more polarized, and it's increasingly the latter, I think. I mean, the country just is really dividing into a blue America and a red America. When Kennedy ran against Nixon in 1960, all but about 14 states were competitive. They were decided by 10 points or less. You fast forward 40 years, the election's about the same outcome between Bush and Gore, and about 28 states are out of play. They're decided by 10 points or more. So we have a blue America and a red America and a handful of purple states in between. We're seeing it in the state legislatures, which are increasingly unified. We have almost a record number of unified state legislatures because the conservative states are becoming red and the liberal states becoming more blue.
But that is interesting.
Do you think that that the people in Congress, the people in the Senate would work together better if they're told, okay, the election is over, we're not going to have any divisible split anymore, because once the person is elected, they don't just represent the people in their state that voted for them of their same party, they represent all the parties, all the people in the state. So how come they can't vote that way? Why do they insist on being divided even after the election when they do represent all the people and not just the handful that voted for them?
Well, because their electoral fortunes do hinge on representing their states and districts, and those states and districts, because the red states are getting redder and the blue states bluer, and because of gerrymandering, there's mostly non-competitive general elections in 390, 400 of the 435 House seats. If you start to work in the middle, you become attacked by one side or the other. Look at these gangs of 8 and gangs of 14 who, look what's happened to Marco Rubio, who said, let's kind of have a sensible compromise on immigration. Now he's an outlier among conservatives and is attacked from the right, and you could say the same thing of liberals like Democrats like Joe Lieberman, who used to be always part of these gangs of 8 in the Senate. I mean, they get ostracized from both sides.
That's absolutely true, yeah.
and there's no overlap. One of the things I look at is National Journal keeps track of who the most the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. And back in the 1980s, there were 40 to 45 senators in the U.S. Senate between the most conservative Democrat, who was a guy named Ed Zirinsky from Nebraska, and the most liberal Republican, who was a guy named Lowell Weichler from Connecticut, who Bill Buckley and other conservatives drove out to elect Joe Lieberman, a Democrat. There used to be 50 senators in between the farthest most left Republican and the farthest most right Democrat. And then there was 23 a decade later. Then there was 7. Then there was 2. Then there was Scott Brown, and now there are none. There is nobody, in other words, to the left, right, of the most conservative Republican, and nobody to the right of the most liberal.
Isn't that interesting? And you know what?
There's no center.
And we feel that here in talk radio, too. And we need to take a little break, but this is such a fascinating conversation. Tom Schaller is on the phone. Am I saying your name right, Tom? Thomas?
Yep, of course.
The book is called The Stronghold, and Jim Penna is joining us. Many of you know Jim. Jim is actually with the Constitution Party. We'll take a little break, and we'll be right back.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. It'll be mostly cloudy, breezy, and warm today with a shower or two around through the early afternoon hours. Perhaps a thunderstorm in spots with highs generally in the low to mid-70s. Slow clearing tonight, but it will turn colder. Lows in the mid-30s in some of the northern interior spots to 47 on the coast. Tomorrow, mostly sunny, high 63 to 67. Mostly cloudy Wednesday with a high of 68 to 72. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Joe Lundberg.
That was the sound of a tree falling. It could be your tree. You're going to have it trimmed, but never got around to calling Pride Tree Service. It could have fallen in a field, and now all you have to do is call Pride Tree Service, and they'll have it quickly out of the way for a great price. But don't wait until the tree falls. It may not fall in the field. It may hit your car, your house, or worse. So call Pride Tree Service today and avoid all those headaches before they happen. Pride Tree Service, 840-0750. That's 840-0750.
All right, thank you. Tom Schaller is on the phone. The book is called The Stronghold. Tom is a professor of political science at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and he writes a political column for the Baltimore Sun. In his book, again, The Stronghold, How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. And an interesting point you just made off the air, if you could just repeat that in criticizing Boehner and the Republicans in general for not doing their job, they're actually doing their job because they're holding back what they are opposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I had this epiphany moment when I was writing the book, and I had actually started out writing a very different book looking at the change in the conservative movement and the Republican Party between the Bush presidencies, Bush 41 and 43. And I was interviewing Grover Norquist, and we were talking about, this rise of the congressional Republicans in the early 90s. And he said to me, well, you can govern with just the House. And I remember walking around my own house for about 3 days going, and Grover Norquist is kind of a quotable, bombastic guy. And I was like, he's really jacking with me here. Like, how would he possibly say that? And my politics are more liberal. And I thought to myself, well, if you think governing means passing new laws and expanding government and the size and scope and its spending and so forth, of course you can't, quote-unquote, govern with the House. But if your philosophical orientation is to shrink and thwart and slow and dilute and to repeal, and of course the House Republicans voted 54 times to repeal Obamacare, and you can keep your 218 House votes together, in some senses, you can, quote-unquote, I'm doing air quotes here for your radio listeners, you can govern if governing means stopping, not doing. And so when Boehner said, we should be judged by the laws we repeal, not by the laws we replace, I remind Democrats and liberals, that should be taken seriously. He considers that an achievement that the 113th is the least productive Congress in history, not a failure.
It's an interesting point.
Gridlock is good.
Gridlock is sometimes good, yeah. But I wanted to clarify what I meant before the break about it even affects us in talk radio, because if you look at the heavy hitters in talk radio, like the Rush Limbaughs and Sean Hannity's, etc., their fan base appreciates them being extreme to the right in their case. I mean, unless you're Howard Stern, there's not too many that are big main-time broadcasters that can be a little bit moderate. Even in this small-time market that Robin and I are in, I got chastised for a lot, but I mean, specifically with Marco Rubio, because I kind of liked what his thoughts were about immigration, but that didn't sit well with a lot of the far-right listeners.
Well, I was on WBAL, which is the conservative flagship in Baltimore and therefore the state of Maryland, and you can hear it in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and parts of Virginia if you're, at night. And they brought me on for a while with the late Ron Smith, who was the longtime anchor there, because he opposed the Iraq War, and people were like, oh, that's not conservative enough to oppose the Iraq War. And then within a few years, when things went sour and it looked like the Bush administration had gone too far and that neoconservative foreign policy was destroying the Republican Party, which it did a damage to its brand that had been built up for 30 years, whether you agree with them or not. There's no question empirically that public opinion polls show that Republicans were the quote-unquote daddy party, the more trusted party on foreign policy until about 2005, and Bush destroyed it all in about 3 or 4 years. But there was a listener revolt in Baltimore against a 30-year bona fide conservative host because it was considered not in lockstep, So these things do happen, and there's these purity tests, and frankly, they happen in both parties.
What's really interesting, though, is that for this election that's coming up, the scope of American politics is branching out into the United States. So Larry had a story this morning that New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is planning a trip to England because a lot of there are 15 or so New Jersey companies that have gone to England, and now he's making a trip over there to rally their support and to rally the support of the British people for if he decides to run. And it's very interesting that this is leaving the United States.
Well, I think politics is, to some degree, has always left the borders, but yeah, we are becoming an increasingly globalized nation, and I think one of the things we're learning about presidents, much like we've long known about governors not really being able to control the state of their economy, it's really national forces. We're now seeing that sort of parallel in the national level. The presidents have not zero ability, of course, but they have an increasingly limited ability to control the national economy because it is a globalized economy, and so governors have to start, thinking about things like that, and presidents certainly have to think about those kinds of things, and because the economy is really less and less controlled domestically than it used to be even 30 or 40 years ago.
We in the third party movement think that government should get out of our way and we'll take care of the economy.
yeah. Tom, I want to ask you something about the book itself. The book is called The Stronghold, and based on what you've said to us today, it sounds like you have a very scientific approach to politics and trying to look at it like a scientist, so that you're not influenced by your own leanings. And that sounds like the way the book is probably written. But I wanted to ask you about the students who are your students. Do they lean one way or the other, or is it just as mixed as the general population at large? And how do they receive your book? Do they read into your book what their own politics are?
I never sign my own books in class. I think it's self-serving to require students to write a $25 check or even get a used copy, and then some of the royalties end up in your pocket or whatever. So occasionally I'll photocopy and put a chapter up, as a PDF. But students today, I think they're, in the Obama era, they've moved a little bit more left than they were just 10 or 15 years ago. I've been teaching now since I taught my first class of graduate student in 1990, and I've taught at 5 public universities: Florida State, UNC, Chapel Hill, Binghamton University, Ohio University, and now UMBC. And the students are different there. The students, I think, were more liberal. Let's say Binghamton, they were a lot of downstate, Long Island and New York City students, so it was a reflection of the state. Students in Ohio, I think, were probably the most conservative, maybe North Carolina, now that I think about it. Right? So some of it's generational. I think some of it's regional. I mean, we don't socialize, I think, children the way we used to, where, you talk about politics at the family table. I think that is gone now. I mean, maybe I'm hyperventilating a little bit, but I think still children mimic sort of their parents' attitudes, and so you do see patterns with young Southerners are more conservative than young Northerners.
Going back to the how word and thinking about the voters who voted in the Republican Congress and the Democratic president, do you think it's more about the economy, more about national security? What exactly do you think is the motivating agenda for most people?
Well, that's hard to say. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the Republicans becoming a more Congress-based party and what the implications of that are for the party's presidential competitiveness is that 20 years ago that was clear that the consensus was the culture wars, for example. If you view politics as sort of three bundles: economic, domestic policy, foreign policy, military security, and then cultural and social issues, that the Democrats were clearly struggling on the social issues, and maybe they were considered a little stronger on domestic kitchen table economic issues, Social Security and things like that, and the Republicans had the advantage in foreign policy. So any party that wins 2 out of 3 sort of dominates, and Republicans were winning presidential elections with foreign policy and social issues. But now the conventional wisdom, just 20 years later, 20 years after the Defense of Marriage Act, is that the Democrats are on the right side of history, and the polls are moving in their direction on marijuana legalization and on gay rights and other sorts of things. And you see Republicans avoiding. You see Larry Hogan, our own brand new installed last week Republican governor, who spent the entire 2014 campaign saying, I disagree on abortion policy and marijuana and this stuff, but I consider it settled law. And Republican candidates being advised by the National Party to stay away from social issues. So now if the social issues are in the Democratic bundle, it really becomes a fight, I think, over one of the two, either economic policy, where the Democrats are taking a big hit now in the wake of the economy, although it's coming back a little bit, and then I think you're going to see a new fight over foreign policy in the post-neoconservative era. Like, what is Republican foreign policy post-George W. Bush? And I think the way the party defines itself there will be very interesting, because they really sort of lost that edge on that policy bundle for a little while, and they need to restore it if they want to be a presidential party.
When the Founding Fathers founded the country and the Constitution and everything, they were happy with the jobs. You know, they all own their own businesses and things like that, and they did receive a stipend for serving. Do you think that because of these enormous salaries now that all of the elected officials receive, that this really jades their governing? Should those salaries be reduced? And
no, I'm an outlier on this count, and I believe in the market, right? Why would we pay a member of Congress $125,000 when they can go out and immediately, like $500,000, lobbying their former colleagues with half the stress, nobody showing up at all their public events, no letters to answer, and a much easier golf course-oriented life where they mostly work when the Congress is in session. They don't have to fly home on Thursday and come back every Tuesday for 4 days of rubber chicken dinners at the county fair. I mean, think about the market incentives there. I think we should pay politicians more. The federal expenses for salaries and health care benefits and even their pension is a fraction of 1% of federal spending, and you get what you pay for. I mean, the President of the United States makes $400,000, and Steven Schwartzman, hedge funds trader, makes $40 billion. What kind of society does that tell you? I mean, we pay our brand new teachers with a master's degree $40,000, and we pay hotshot kids who played lacrosse at Hopkins University here $120,000 to be bond traders, and then we wonder why our teachers are bad and we complain about them. I thought in the market economy you get what you pay for. If you buy a $20 pair of shoes, don't complain to me when they wear out. And if you pay for a politician at $100,000, don't be surprised that they're inclined to be bribed or to leave or do a bad job or look for things on the side or become a lobbyist. And that's what they do. Half of former senators right now are lobbyists in this town. It's crazy.
One of the big dividing issues between Republicans and Democrats is the corporate influence on our elected officials. So let me ask you about that real quickly. Obviously, corporations have the right to make as much money as they want, and the CEO has the right, the company has the right to decide how much money that person gets. And while we have this disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest in this country, it's not un-American to do that. Whose fault is it? Is it the corporations bribing, for lack of a better word? It's probably an unfair word, but bribing our elected officials, or are the elected officials just at fault for being weak and accepting the money?
Well, I think a little bit of both, and I think both parties have sort of been, acting in concert on this, or sort of colluding, whether knowingly or not. I mean, and I think the Democratic Party, starting with Clinton and Gore and the centrist Democratic Leadership Council, became a more corporatized party. I think my stock line on this is that the Democrats are a partially owned subsidiary of corporate America, and the Republicans are a wholly owned subsidiary. The problem that I warn, and I make this very clear in the last chapter of the book, is I don't think anybody would argue that greater corporate influence in our governance moves the country left. It clearly moves it right, and that's a problem for Republicans, because when Republicans move right, they move to the far right, and when Democrats move to the right, at least pulls them to the center. And back in the early mid-1980s, when the Democrats only had the House for a while there, and the Republicans under Reagan had the Senate and the presidency, it was Clinton and Gore and centrist, sort of business-oriented Democrats who recaptured the party from its base and moved it to the center. But there is no such moderate institution. There is no Republican Leadership Council. It disbanded in 2011. And the Republican Main Street Partnership, that moderate with Charlie Bass and Christine Todd Whitman, they're on life support. So where is the moderate alternative for the Republicans that's pulling the party a little bit back toward the center?
Well, there are some. I think the argument I would make is that when you say that corporate involvement in the Democrats puts them into a more moderate, but to the Republicans, it puts them far right. It almost is hypocritical. It's like saying we can accept money because we're going to be moderate now, but you can't because you're gonna be extreme.
Well, that's true. There's a different asymmetrical effect there, but the point is that when both parties move right, one party moves to the center and the other party moves to the far right. That's just true.
What a wonderful interview and a great conversation. I wish we had more time. The book is called The Stronghold. Thomas F. Schaller. Real quickly, do you have a website?
I do. It's umbc.edu/Schaller.
Okay, and I'm sure it's on Amazon and the other booksellers?
Of course.
Okay. Thank you. What a great conversation. This is WOCA Ocala. We'll be right back.
Fox News Radio, I'm Pat O'Neill. The Midwest slammed with another winter storm. A foot of snow in the Detroit area making driving tough.
Some roads are plowed, some